Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. We're going to leave a little bit more time for everyone to get logged in. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like, as we get started in just one more minute. Okay, why don't we get started? It looks like there's still more people coming in, but it's slowed down just a tiny bit. So we're 2 minutes after 1 o'clock here, at least. So I'm Nicole Pogowski. I'm an associate librarian at the University of Arizona Libraries, and I'm also a CLAPS committee member. Before we start, we wanted to have someone from our committee wrap up the conference before handing it over to our moderator. So first, to repeat our land acknowledgement from the opening keynote, the University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. As an institution built upon the original territories of the O'odham, we acknowledge the Indigenous Sonoran Desert communities, past and present, who have stewarded this region throughout generations. And instead of just acknowledging the land, we also suggest that if you're able to give back to some of these communities, whether it's our local communities here in Tucson or wherever you're located. One suggestion was the Tohono O'odham Community College, which is that first link. The second one is the Native American Advancement Foundation. And please feel free to share your suggestions in the chat. And these slides are available on our website. So it's on the schedule page. You can access them there if you want the links. So we want to thank everyone for attending. We want to thank those who've presented and also our volunteers who've helped to moderate sessions. And to all, thank you for your patience with any hiccups we've had as we've pivoted to hosting this conference online and also hosting about 10 times as many people as we normally do for CLAPS. And then we thank the University of Arizona Libraries for funding this conference each year so that registration is always free for attendees. And our committee this year was Amanda Meeks, Yvonne Mary, Laura Miller, me, Jeremiah Paskey-Wood, Anthony Sanchez, Mary Beth Slobotnik, and Niev Wallace. And we also thank Nicole Hennig for web support and, as I said before, our volunteers for moderating sessions. And okay, so we have recordings that will be posted on the website. I don't know exactly when, but it should be within a week or two after the conference ends. Also, any conference materials that the presenters have made available will be there as well. And we will be sending out a feedback survey soon, possibly today, and it's going to close on September 30th. So we ask you to please provide your feedback before then. As I said, these opening slides that I'm showing now are on our website. A lot of people have used this slide here before they've presented. So if you want to access any of this, it's on the site. And just some things to keep in mind in approaching the Q&A session when we get to that. Just thinking about, did you peer review your question? And I won't reread these again. I don't know if everybody was at the opening keynote, but I don't want to take too much time away from our closing keynote here. And so thank you, everyone. And I'm going to hand it over to Freya, who is the moderator for the session, and she will introduce Dr. Cabrera.
Sorry about that. So hello, everyone. My name is Freya Arneson, and I'm with the Arizona Libraries, and I'll be moderating today. So Dr. Nolan Cabrera is a nationally recognized expert in the areas of racism and anti-racism on college campuses, whiteness, and ethnic studies. He is currently an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona and was the only academic featured in the MTV documentary White People. His book, White Guys on Campus, is a deep exploration of white male racism and occasional anti-racism on college campuses. The text, Jeff Chang, author of We Can Be All Right, described as a timely, provocative, even hopeful book. Additionally, Dr. Cabrera was an expert witness in the Tucson Unified Mexican-American Studies case, Ark v. Douglas, which is the highest profile ethnic studies case in the country's history. He's given hundreds of lectures, keynote addresses, and trainings throughout the country, on challenging racism, whiteness, working through unconscious bias, creating inclusive college campuses, and the expansion of ethnic studies programs. Dr. Cabrera is an award-winning scholar whose numerous publications have appeared in some of the most prestigious journals in the fields of education and racial studies. He completed his graduate work at UCLA in higher education and organizational change, and Dr. Cabrera earned his BA from Stanford University in comparative studies in racism and ethnicity with an education focus. He is a former director of a Boys and Girls Club in the San Francisco Bay Area and is originally from McMinnville, Oregon. Thank you so much, Dr. Cabrera, for speaking today, and thank you for signing the books. For those of you who participated in the raffle and won, you should have received your book soon, if not already. And as for format, you're all welcome to use the chat, but if you want a question answered, please put it in the Q&A. And immediately following the keynote session, we'll be hosting at 2:15, hosting a breakout discussion on his book, White Guys on Campus. So thank you, and I'll hand it over.
All right, my beautiful people, thank you so much for being here. And I cannot believe that I'm on a call also. I just saw that somebody's from McMinnville, Oregon as well. If you don't know where McMinnville is, that's kind of the point. There aren't many of us out here. So Maureen Barney, all right, go Grizzlies, all that good stuff. All right, waxing nostalgic for my childhood aside, I appreciate you all being here. And just to be completely transparent, I was extraordinarily nervous when I received this invitation because, you know, I'm a scholar of higher education and racism, and not necessarily so much, you know, I kept asking myself, what am I going to be telling librarians that would be of value to them? And so, you know, I crowdsourced this a little bit with my friends, and none of them were very helpful because they basically just kept regurgitating stupid stereotypes about, dude, you have a really big personality and librarians are just going to spend all their time hushing you with all, you know, ha ha ha, librarian, all that good stuff. Anyway, but one of my colleagues really came up and said, you know what, we're all of our work, you as an academic and librarians in their work, it's all around knowledge, truth, and then the dissemination of said knowledge and truth. And as soon as that went off, it was like, oh my God, absolutely, yeah, because the exact same structures of power and oppression that we see creating a need for Black Lives Matter in the streets regarding police brutality inform the ways in which knowledge is constructed within the largely racist ivory tower. And so I started to riff on this idea of from Black Lives Matter to Black Knowledge Matters and expand that beyond, that was just a cute, catchy title, but then to move that more to BIPOC people and really kind of try to work through this, because at the end of the day, I'm very much guided by the Noam Chomsky's on the responsibility of intellectuals, and he was very, very straightforward in the way that he described this, where he said the responsibility of an intellectual is to pursue truth and to disrupt lies. Those two very basic things. But the problem is that to pursue knowledge, there are so many power dynamics there, which is interesting because there's that age-old adage that knowledge is power, but also the ability to create knowledge and also to have it validated is power. And to access knowledge is also power. And so it's not just that knowledge is power, but the production and dissemination of it all are parts of power. And it was interesting because the example, I'm extremely glad that we started with the land acknowledgement, and I gave a quick shout out to Native SOAR, an incredible local organization doing some of the most phenomenal outreach for the in native lands here. If you are looking for someone to donate to, there's a link in the chat there. But we absolutely are on stolen native land. And I use that term intentionally because a lot of times with land acknowledgements, it's, well, we're kind of like our provost a few years back, not the current one, said, yeah, we borrowed the land from the Tohono people. I'm like, you did not. No, you didn't borrow it. We are living on stolen land, and it was taken through force, through theft. And as a consequence, we've built up a multi-billion-dollar industry on top of it. And so when I start talking about higher education and knowledge and production, I have to start from three very basic premises. They shouldn't be controversial, but the fact that they are is a statement about how kind of backwards our times are. And that is, number one, our institutions of higher education exist on stolen native lands. Number two, that said that the initial buildings that were created for higher education were built by slave labor and exploited labor. And ultimately, this is number three is more tying it all together, especially in the wake of 9/11, that historically and even contemporarily, people of color have never had equitable representation within institutions of higher education. We haven't had equitable representation in terms of the people who occupy our buildings. We've never had adequate representation or equitable representation in terms of what constitutes knowledge within the academy. And that, for me, is a history that we should, quote unquote, never forget. And that should be the foundation of all of the work that we have going forward. Because in the absence of that, then what ends up happening, and I so appreciate the way that the land acknowledgement went, that there was a call to do something with it instead of just saying, oh my God, I need to get rid of some of my guilt. Here's a land acknowledgement. Okay, now I'm not a racist anymore. No. Ultimately, what this is saying is that there is what Gloria Ladson-Billings, the esteemed critical race theorist, refers to as an educational debt that is owed to communities of color. And usually that is a debt that goes unpaid. However, it's one that should be continually brought up, and people continually ask, well, what is owed to communities of color as a result of this? And one part of that debt, again, is the systematic exclusion of our knowledge bases from institutions of higher education. Now, as I was thinking this through, another one of my friends said, why are you even going to riff on knowledge and truth? Because everything that's disruptive gets labeled as fake news. We're in a post-truth society. And actually, that's precisely the reason why I keep coming back to these issues of truth and knowledge. Now, I want to be clear that, well, let me back up, that I go back to truth and knowledge because in a time where it's so disrupted, it makes it all the more important. There's so many lies and too many to disrupt, but we still need to pursue truth. And I know that that term, a lot of times my friends and colleagues will kind of shy away from the term truth. They'll shy away from knowledge-based claims because in terms of our epistemic orientations, folks will say, you're just recreating white supremacy. You're just it's part of that Enlightenment philosophy that guided so much of that created so many of our problems that we're dealing with right now, that really served to intellectually marginalized communities of color. And I'm very aware of that. But I use truth in the sense that because I don't believe that all claims of truth are equally valid. Um, so obviously ones that are informed by white supremacy and racism, it's incredibly important to call those out. But also we need to be clear that not all views from communities of color are equally valid either. That is that, if we're talking about truth within a community, that's a collective knowledge base, and we're always going to have outliers within that. And I'll get to that issue in a little bit. But ultimately, what I want to do is I never abandon truth. Instead, what I want to do is expand what constitutes truth. And because for me, it is a truism that power informs all components of knowledge creation. And critical race theory has been central in establishing this and doing this. And so this is a little difficult for me because I don't have an entire sense of the room. So for those who don't know, critical race theory was derived from critical legal studies, which was basically Marxist legal studies. And then it was taken up within the field of education in the early 90s. The basic premise is not that controversial now. It was extremely radical at that time. And the premise was that in the early 90s, people kept thinking about racism as this individual defect. And, like there are racists and non-racists. And instead of, but the problem is that people were able to change their views, or at least their professed views, to seem less racist, but racism still persisted on a structural and ideological level. And so instead, critical race theorists started from the premise that racism is endemic to society and that there is truth within communities of color. And that one basic premise became so controversial that the current president, who A Tribe Called Quest refers to as Agent Orange, actually banned the use of critical race theory within federal diversity trainings. Now, it was kind of funny when he did that. It wasn't funny, but there were some chuckles among critical race theorists when he did that, because a lot of us have been saying for a long time, diversity trainings tend to be very feel good. Let me work through my personal biases, and that's great, but they don't really get to any real meaningful structural change, and they tend to be divorced from critical race theory. And part of what we've been theorizing is that a big part of the reason why critical race theory isn't part of diversity trainings is because that would make those diversity trainings effective. It would really make them anti-racist instead of kind of playing around the edges. It calls for massive structural change instead of, basically what they call rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. And so with that, one of the things that is key to it is explicitly naming and calling out white supremacy in society. And if you allow me quickly to go on a brief tangent, and again, it's hard for me to get a sense of the room because, I'm looking at my screen and seeing the chat. But while I've been very pleased to see the term white supremacy be more used in a colloquial sense, even when I give talks nowadays, there's still kind of a collective tension, especially among white people in the audience who I'm presenting to. And a lot of times I'll get some very, very well-intentioned but semi-patronizing advice about, well, aren't you in danger of losing your audience by using such an overt term to describe the contemporary racism? And what's weird about that is that very rarely do people challenge me on the accuracy of the term, because there's massive continuity between the way that the country was structured from pre-colonial times through chattel slavery and native genocide, Reconstruction, theft of Mexico, all the way through. And then there was that little blip in the 1960s, and then just it keeps going. So very rarely do people actually question the validity of that term. Instead, what they say is, are you losing your audience? And for me, my very quick retort is, I'm not concerned about catering to white fragility. And if that part does make me lose you as an audience member, sit with a little bit of the discomfort that you're feeling and understand that it is much more difficult for people of color to thrive and survive amidst white supremacy than it is for you to feel comfortable with it or uncomfortable with the terminology. Moving back to it, however, we come back to these issues of knowledge construction, and critical race theory has been huge at both bridging knowledge bases within communities of color, as well as and bridging it into the institutions of higher education. Very early on, scholars were critiquing what they called an apartheid of knowledge. And it can be extremely difficult to break through, because if we look back at that history of never forget and how our institutions of higher education were structured to be exclusionary, and there's a massive history of being racially exclusionary, it's not surprising that the knowledge base that's used is also reflects that racial exclusion. But people have been pushing back against it. But I always have to frame it as it's always pushing back against it, because these institutions were not set up for us to succeed. They were set up to exclude us. The obvious way that happened early on was that initially our institutions of higher education were meant to be sort of a playground of the aristocracy. And then all of a sudden they said, this is kind of getting annoying, because, these rich kids from New England, where their intellectual pursuits, maybe we should do more of a meritocracy. So they started doing things like standardized tests and the SAT. Well, what ends up happening? Jewish folks start killing it on the SAT, and then the Ivy Leagues say, whoa, time out. We need to put a cap on the number of Jewish people who can be in our institutions, because that's just not right. You fast forward a couple hundred years, and right now you still have people who are challenging affirmative action. And we all know that without affirmative action protocols in place, you end up excluding communities of color. You end up excluding low-income folk. But yet, even with this very modest, it's an important, but it's not as massive a program as people think that it is. With that one important program, it's still too much. And then every admission cycle, you see some crying white person from an upper class neighborhood saying, if only I lived in South Central and was Chicano, I would have gotten into Brown University. But unfortunately, I had my dreams stripped away from me because an undeserving minority took my spot. And you hear that every single year. And yet, you never hear on the flip side of it, the kid who's actually from East LA, who had his dreams smashed because he didn't have all of the structural advantages that rich kids from the other side of LA had. Getting back to it though, what critical race theory has been beautiful about doing is identifying those knowledge bases within communities of color, finding that truth within our experiences. And it goes back very much to the work of the critical theorist Paulo Freire, because he argued, who is better to understand the experiences of oppression, to better analyze oppression, than the oppressed themselves? He was magnificent at articulating that and validating the knowledge within the marginalized communities. And it's so important, because otherwise what you end up having in terms of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination is actually knowledge that does harm to communities of color. About 50 years ago, well, more than that, 60 or 70 years ago, the anthropologist Oscar Lewis was very famous for constructing a thesis around what he called a culture of poverty. Essentially, that there was a cycle within low-income, in particular low-income Chicano communities, where they would get bought into this idea of, like, there was sort of a culture around their poverty, and it became self-sustaining. And basically it said poor people are poor and they're the ones who are perpetuating it. And that one thesis by someone from the outside of the community has been incredibly damaging. There's a person who I'm not going to name directly because she doesn't need to get any more shouts out than she already gets, who tours low-income Title I schools throughout the country and basically tells teachers, "Don't worry about it. It's not your fault. You can't do anything because these kids are stuck in a culture of poverty." Even though this has been debunked numerous times. In contrast to that, some of my dear friends and colleagues, Luis Moll, Norma Gonzalez, and then in the new generation, Judy Marquez Kiama, have been developing this concept called funds of knowledge, and looking at the ways that knowledge is built and developed within marginalized communities in ways that far exceed anything that most scholarly inquiries have ever gone down. Looking at a 7-year-old child who's doing translation for their parents. So the monolingual Spanish-speaking parent, they're doing translation for them in a doctor's office and having to learn medical terms on the fly and do this in between doctor-parent. And they were able to take that knowledge base, produce it in scholarly ways, and really disrupt the white hegemony within institutions of higher education, and particularly within the way we conceive of knowledge. And that's what's so very troubling as a history, but also promising as a future, is that as our institutions diversify, the knowledge base is also diversifying. And I don't mean diversity as in like the watered down heroes and holidays, foods and fiestas. I mean like as in critical analyses linked into marginalized communities. And for one of the first times ever, really leveraging our institutional power, institutional resources for general community uplift. It hasn't happened yet on a systemic level, but there are pockets that continually give me hope and give me uplift as we're all continually struggling. Because what they did and are continuing to do in practice is take knowledge from the Mexican American community and bring it into academia. They're making it disseminated throughout. And by disseminating that knowledge, which is where you as librarians become so critically important, people in other locales have picked up funds of knowledge and have run with it and developed meaningful assets-based approaches to education that value and validate where our students are coming from and then build up off of it. We are far from any place of equity, but the point being that despite racism being endemic in society, as critical race theorists will have us acknowledge and know, there are always what Bush refers to as cracks in the walls of whiteness. And what we're doing right now is exploiting them. We are finding them, and if you can't see them, it means you're not close enough to that dam. Because always remember this one truism: no system of oppression is complete because it is a reflection of the incomplete people who create it. It may feel like a totality, but there are always structural fissures. And that's where we can organize. That's where we can push. That's where we can offer meaningful opportunities throughout. At the same time, and not to go on too much of a tangent, we're also faced, in terms of knowledge production, with a massive issue of what my dear friend and colleague Gary Rhodes refers to as academic capitalism. And that is that in contemporary, while knowledge has always had a capitalist tinge to it, in modern times, especially with the divestment from public education, which is exactly what's been going on. Every year, the governor's budget goes down and down and down and down and down. With that divestment, institutions of higher education are acting more and more and more entrepreneurially. The classic example with the University of Arizona is that we now made a pact with the for-profit Ashford University, for-profit online institution that's currently being sued by the state of California because it was exploiting low-income Black and brown folk as well as veterans, giving them basically a subpar education while concurrently getting all of the Pell Grant loans, veterans loans, everything like that coming through their institution. We thought that would be a great idea to make that as a partnership, but it gets to this issue of academic capitalism. We're acting in these entrepreneurial ways that have complete disregard for the communities and the impacts that it will have on said communities. And in that sense, with that complete disregard, what ends up happening is that folks are going after cash. And so what ends up happening is the production of knowledge tends to reflect elite bourgeoisie interests. It is not a coincidence, therefore, that we, for example, not to be too crude, but we have Viagra, but don't have really a good academic way of producing clean water in Flint, Michigan. We know how to produce bombs because the military industrial complex is so massive. We know how to destroy life. But something very basic like supporting the elimination of malaria is too much. The proportionality, and please keep in mind, there are people working against the grain in all of these, and I'm not diminishing their work in any way, shape, or form. I honor it, and I say that their work is incredible. But the point being that we know more about how to destroy life than even the basic issue of how to educate the most marginalized communities in our society, how to support them through education. We know more about blowing things up because, again, it reflects this notion of academic capitalism. It reflects these elite interests. And it basically becomes an academic version. Sorry, I got inspiration by looking in here with the Wu-Tang Clan, that cash rules everything around me. But again, just because it is that way does not mean it has to be that way. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I wanted to go back and revisit sort of the original purposes of higher education and how we got to this mode of knowledge production. And ultimately, it was based upon this Enlightenment philosophy. And the general idea was that the construction of knowledge would hit upon universal truths. And through that construction of knowledge, that we would be uplifting all people. It was very much sort of a pushback against the Dark Ages where rationality had no basis. And at the end of the day, though, what we're finding is that no, not all, more knowledge does not necessarily lift up people. However, targeted approaches to knowledge and knowledge construction and intentionally linking it together absolutely can. And at the end of the day, I don't necessarily disagree with that higher education has no part, or I disagree with some of my colleagues who just say the ivory tower is so corrupt, it's beyond save, and we just need to tear it down and do something else. But I actually see a lot of potential. And I know that this is me. Some people call it naive, I call it hopeful. That there's always an opportunity to transform the system. I do not give up on issues of academic freedom. I do not give up on the potential for knowledge, but I think that we need to reformulate the original conceptions of higher education, where with these Enlightenment ideas, it was a more educated person, a more educated society creates societal uplift, and that's the basis of humanity. I go back to Paulo Freire because he argued that oppression is necessarily dehumanizing, but through collective anti-oppressive practice, or praxis, excuse me, that we have the ability to collectively reclaim our humanity in the process. And from that, that also means that the creation and dissemination of anti-oppressive knowledge is actually the core of what gets to our humanity, our collective uplift. Because at the end of the day, I end up, God, I've been saying that a lot. Let me try that again. I have weird verbal clicks. Ultimately, this work is an uphill battle because of all of the structural issues at play. But that's what makes it so critically important, and why I remain perpetually hopeful. Not hopeful, like I said, in a naive or kind of a Pollyanna-ish way, but hopeful in the way that Cornel West talks about it, as in hope does not require optimism. It does not take the perspective of a bystander looking at the evidence in front of me and saying that things are necessarily going to get better. It instead says that, again, returning to the incomplete nature of the human condition, that there's always possibility for this anti-oppressive work, this anti-capitalist, this anti-white supremacist work. And if I cannot see it, it means that I either lack the will or the creative imagination to put together an idea of a better future in there. And so I remain perpetually hopeful in the way that Paulo Freire talks about hope as an ontological need, the basis for everything that we do. In the absence of hope, we can do nothing. And then folks ask me the ultimate question, well, then what do I do next? And I may have some guidance on specific questions, but I don't have that. Because we have a philosophical orientation, but the path forward is very murky. But that's precisely why Paulo Freire said that we make the road by walking. So that's my challenge to each one of you, is to be intentionally connected with anti-oppressive scholars so that you can disseminate their knowledge and push forward and reimagine what our ivory tower should look like so that it actually represents our communities and our knowledge bases. And my challenge to you is to walk, create that path, go forth with courage, go forth with humility, and most importantly, please take care of yourselves in these really tumultuous times. So I think that's about my time. I really appreciate all the chat, and I welcome all of your questions. Thank you so much for your engagement.
Okay, so it looks like there's a couple questions in the Q&A, and one of them, the first one is, what do you think libraries can do to dismantle systems of racism and oppression in higher education?
I mean,
small question, right?
Cheapity Christmas. Well, here's the difficulty. Let me back up really quickly. Now, I'm not going to. I will not infer anything on the intention of the question itself. I'm going to say sometimes when I get this question, it gets implied that I'm going to give you kind of a 10-step anti-racism plan. And so I cannot do that right now. I can never do that because, again, white supremacy is so ingrained in our structures and our systems that it exists everywhere. But that's the point, is that you can do things intentionally to disrupt it all over. So a couple of big ones. Number one is diversification of the workforce. Like have the librarian workforce look more like the communities themselves. Number two, and this is a little controversial because because ivory towers continually try to keep separation from the rest of the community, but you have an infrastructure in place. You can create it as a community space. Now, granted, in the times of COVID, it's very hard to do that, but intentional outreach to the local communities can be incredibly important in bridging that gap between institutions of higher education and the community as a whole. I mean, we have, you would not believe how many times I'm in the south side of Tucson, which is not that far from the university, and I'll be working with different parents or students, and unless it's to go to either a basketball game or a football game, there's just this disconnect between the community and the U of A. And sometimes it actually even seems because the U of A is so big, it can seem really intimidating. And so you can do intentional outreach to do that, no, we are a land grant institution. We exist to serve the people of Arizona. You should be here. You should have a place here. And you can send messages like that by hosting community events in the libraries themselves. And last but not least, again, with the knowledge creation, try to work with groups and collectives that are producing this counter-hegemonic knowledge. That go beyond just, I mean, I know that it's that Harvard Press and Duke University Press and University of California Press are always going to be in your ear about adopt our books and do all this stuff. They're always going to be there doing that, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. But find alternative ways, alternative areas. I mean, the Rethinking Schools Collective has been phenomenal at saying we don't have to keep subscribing to the way that you do things. We're going to write our books about our people, have it very pragmatically oriented so communities can use them, apply them, and to end up saying it's basically like an academic version of FUBU, like for us, by us. We're doing this work for ourselves. And oh yeah, and Yasmin just said right there, that we are expanding the notion of what's considered a credible source. In critical race theory, there has been some incredible work around counter narrative. So you have the dominant narrative where communities of color are, that they're places of social despair, and that there is this culture of poverty, and there have been these beautiful counter narratives that show just the incredible strength, resilience embedded within the truth that's found in those communities. And so that does challenge us to say what constitutes a truth claim. Because again, not all counter narratives are done equally well. There was a critical race theory teach-in recently where Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of the founders of this work, just she threw it down directly. She said, I would rather see no critical race theory work than bad critical race theory work. And that was a direct thing and that's tough if you're new to the field, because how are you going to be discerning what's good and what's bad? Well, you got to learn. You got to learn what the standards are. You got to learn, because these are alternative ways. It still says that there is a standard. It's not everything goes, but it's an expansive way that's more communally oriented, that's more oriented within marginalized communities. So these are just some areas to look at, but again, it's not a prescription. The other big thing that I would say is that the more that all of these efforts can be connected, the stronger that you will be at doing social transformation. That is, if you just hire more Black and brown folk to occupy your libraries and you say, okay, cool, we did our diversification, we're good, they're going to crumble under the weight. But if you say, we're going to try to expand our knowledge base, we're going to try to diversify, we're going to have more community outreach, and have all these things going on at the same time and in loose coordination with each other, that's how you transform an organizational culture. One-offs never work. One diversity training never works. That's the, I mean, you literally might as well just take the money that you were going to put into that, just burn it and move on. It'll be less of a waste of time and you won't be as frustrated. So if you're going to do it, it has to be intentional, structural, and really understand the different components of your organization. I gave out a couple, but you all know your organizations better than I do. So identify the different ways that racism, white supremacy, and overt capitalism play into that and push back.
So you kind of touched on this, but it's so where do education and libraries intersect in working together to dismantle systemic racism? It seems like departments of education and libraries are working in silos in higher ed.
That's absolutely true. We do not. That's it right there. That I think the question answered itself. That is that our individual efforts need to be more intentionally aligned. And I'll be honest, I'm just as bad about this as the people who, sort of implicitly critiquing, because I'm so caught up in producing knowledge through my scholarly inquiry that I forget sometimes to think about, well, how is this knowledge going to be disseminated? And is it actually going to be taken up? Are people going to be using it? How are they going to be using it? I'm a horrible marketer in that sense. Um, and yeah, and so basically we just need to make more intentional collaborations across those, because on one hand you have the producers of knowledge and the disseminators of knowledge. You've got to, you know, okay, I was going to do a really bad analogy to drug dealers. That's not appropriate right now. So let me try that again. But yeah, it's whatever, that there just needs to be more intentional collaborations around that. Now, the biggest issue is going to be time right now, and um, uh, uh, finding the time to be able to do that, because everybody's um, schedules are so packed right now, especially during a time of COVID. I mean, I've literally been up since about 4 this morning, just trying to respond to emails and write a 10-year letter and doing all this stuff that I'm like, one more thing on my plate. But that's what's so important. And I think, though, that one of the big things that we need to do is stop thinking about libraries as kind of separate, or not separate, that's the wrong way of putting it. I think we as scholars need to reframe our relationship to libraries, because we tend to see it as sort of like these repositories where I can access the knowledge I need, and it's very much a one-way street, without really giving back to the libraries and saying, well, what can I do to support your efforts either?
All right, so another question is, where did the idea of doing research on white guys on campus come from?
Growing up in McMinnville, Oregon.
All right.
And I say that kind of flippantly, but it's okay. I'll tell you what, I'll give you the scholarly example, and then I'll give you like the real example, like the personal example, and they're both true. The scholarly work was that I was an ethnic studies undergrad. I love studying race and racism, but everyone told me you can't, that's not something that you can do. So I thought, well, institutions of higher education are important for both reproducing and sometimes challenging white supremacy. So why don't I go and do that? Well, when I started my grad work, there was this thing called the diversity rationale, and it was really, really hot. It's actually coming back right now because of the Harvard affirmative action case. But it basically says that empirically, by intentionally diversifying our college campuses, that you actually end up with uh, uh, increased learning outcomes for all students, white students included. And that was really important at upholding affirmative action. And I don't want to poo-poo that in any way, shape, or form. But it sends a really troubling message that the inclusion of people of color into largely predominantly white institutions of higher education can only occur to the extent that white people benefit from that as well. I was like, ooh, ouch, that's not good. And then I also kept asking the question, well, where is racism within institutions of higher education? Where are those analyses? And that's when critical race theory was just picking up. So it went uh, from law in the late 1970s and still going, and then it was adapted in education as a whole in about 92, 94, somewhere in there. And then by the late 90s, it started getting taken up by higher education scholars. And so you had these analyses of, how Chicano profs experience racism in their classrooms, or how Black students experience racism on their college campuses. But you didn't end up with, you didn't see the mechanisms. Like, let me back up. If you have, say, a microaggression, you have a microaggressee and a microaggressor, and it only focused on one component of that, and it really missed the other side of it. So basically you had an effect with no cause. And so what I wanted to do was, I said, well, maybe if I interview white guys, which turned into White Guys on Campus, maybe I could actually understand what that cause that leads to the effect is. And most people at that point told me they're going to be too politically correct. They're not going to listen to, they're just going to shut down. And you know what? They opened up to me a lot. For anybody who, has read the book, I mean, let me put it this way. If they're holding back, given their narratives, I would hate to see what they're really feeling. So with all of that, that was sort of what led me to do that. The only reason why I did white guys is I have tried to do the interviews with white women, and that's actually the time where I do get more of the politically correct kind of dancing around. There is a cross-gender dynamic that just doesn't work very well with me because of my positionality. But with the white guys, it worked really, really well. Now, going back to it though, there's always been this persistent question in my head ever since I was growing up in McMinnville, Oregon. Okay. And y'all got to know, for those of you who are in the valley right now, and God, I hope you're all safe. The fires there are just atrocious and break my heart seeing that. In the valley in, the late 80s, early 90s, like McMinnville was probably about 90% white, very evangelical Christian, extraordinarily conservative. And, I was one of the 10%. I mean, I don't really, in Arizona, I don't stand out for nothing. I mean, everybody has kind of the skin and the hair. But in McMinnville, man, you would stand out. And, I had a lot of miseducation about what constituted racism. And it was always really confusing to me when I would have people who cared about me really, really deeply. Like I knew them on a very deep level. And they would say things like, I remember really vividly my sophomore year football coach. He said, Nolan, you're literally the only 4.0 gangster I know. And we didn't have words for microaggressions at that point. But something was wrong about that, because my record's clean. I'm not banging, slanging. I was student body president, perfect grades, go to Stanford undergrad, but yet this says gangster. And I was, and this is my own football coach. He knows me. I've known him for years. A lot of white people continue, joking around, well, you're Mr. Affirmative Action. And just having to navigate that, and that underlying question, because they don't know what they're doing, but it was foul at the same time. Now, the people in McMinnville were a lot more aggressive and more direct. It's kind of a country thing. Like, we don't have time to be that Portland nice. But man, when I would go up to Portland, it was even more difficult. So my parents split, and when I lived with my mom's up in Portland, it was Portland weird before it became trendy to be weird. But it was one of these things, like I was always on edge. I go to like everyday music, and I'd be like, just the looks, and you couldn't put your finger on it, but I was just different enough. And you could never say definitively that they were going to accuse me of stealing their CDs. But I'm like, I just couldn't put my finger on it. But I knew something was wrong. This is how I'm processing in my 14, 15, 16-year-old mind. And that really propelled me during my graduate work of that question. How can ostensibly good people unconsciously recreate this? What's their socialization like, and what are the social structures like that allow them to do this? And largely, they have no clue that they're engaged in any way, shape, or form. And you want to test that because people now know about microaggressions. The easiest way to test that, I do this all the time in trainings. I say, when was the time you were a target of a microaggression? And hands go up constantly. Give example after example after example. Then I flip it on its head. When were you the perpetrator of a microaggression? And that's tough, like just crickets. So again, that's what really propelled me to do this, is a sort of a race-based mirror looking back at whiteness. And in many respects, this is going to sound a little cliched, but kind of a love letter back to my hometown, because I still love and care about these people a great deal, even though they may drive me nuts and they troll me on Twitter all the time. They're still my homies. We came up, we know each other really well, and I do care about them. And but I also see racism as just an unacceptable social structure that has to be dismantled.
Okay, so we have a couple related questions. One of them is, do you have any advice I might offer to first-year students of color when I'm teaching about scholarly literature and scholarly conversations? And the related one is, how do you handle moments in the classroom when students are sharing a racist idea to call them in and bring the class into the dialogue in order to move the conversation to an anti-racist place?
Oh, geez. Okay. Oh, y'all asked some good questions.
There's some.
Y'all asked some tough questions. All right. Um, First things first. With students of color, especially if you're talking about pedagogically, obviously it's important to have scholarly resources available that reflect their lived realities. That's an entire foundation of ethnic studies. If you read the preface to Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror, just a classic history, multicultural history of the United States, where he said, what happens when someone with the authority of a teacher tells the history of this country and you're not in it? It can create a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. And so philosophically, for me, that means that we're constantly trying to create different mirrors. We're trying to offer them opportunities, the ones that would offer more societal uplift. But there needs to be some pedagogical sensitivity to it, because it's actually, some critical race theorists have been extremely good. And I apologize, because I know the article, I can see it in front of me, and I'm not giving proper attribution, which I need to do. But a few critical race theorists have actually started documenting when students of color reject critical race theory. Like, here's this empowerment, it's pushing on a critical analysis, it's reflective of your home, it's reflective of your community. And some of that work is going to be really important as well, because you can't just say, okay, you know what, you're a brown kid from LA, here's Luis Rodriguez's Always Running, and just say, okay, cool, that's it. I guess what I'm saying is, be able to deal with the heterogeneity. Like, we talk about sort of this monolith of like BIPOC folk, but understand there's going to be a massive amount of heterogeneity within their experiences and ideological orientations. And some of it can actually come, and this is a weird dynamic, and I'm not 100% sure how to navigate this. But there's sometimes where, like, during Black History Month, you can actually hear a lot of white folk talking about Black history that you never heard of as a Black person. And it can inadvertently create, we're doing that right now with Hispanic Heritage Month. And I can see it in some of the Chicano students on campus. Well, not this year, obviously, but in previous years, where they're kind of, they had a whitewashed curriculum. They lived in more an area that reflected like where I came from. They didn't have exposure to this kind of scholarly resources. And it can be really off-putting when folks outside the community actually know more about this history than we do. And it can actually cause some students to shut down. It's like, oh, I don't need it. I don't want it, because, and it's a sensitive dynamic, because, we don't want to think that outsiders to our community know more about our community than we do, but it can be interpreted that way. So just be aware of these dynamics and be able to engage them and say, like, look, we all have growth to do. I behind me, I have stacks and stacks and stacks of books that I haven't gotten through, and I love it. I never want to stop learning. I never want to stop growing. I never want to stop developing. And I think that would be the biggest thing for me to you, is try to show folks that you're not perfect, that you're growing, that you're learning, because that will inevitably encourage them to do exactly the same thing. If you can model that vulnerability, if you can model that growth, it works wonders. It's not 100%, but it's really, really important. Now, I talked way too long on that question and forgot the second question. So if you could please remind me.
So how do you handle moments in the classroom when students are sharing a racist idea to call them in and bring the class into the dialogue in order to move the conversation to an anti-racist place?
That's huge. Um, so I'm gonna I'll offer different parameters on this. I absolutely believe in trying to create, uh, I hate this cliche, but you'll understand it, teachable moments for students. But what I also won't do is as they are going through this, I'm not going to just absolutely leave the space open so that their education can be harmful to students of color in the process. And that's a tough dynamic to balance because, and so usually what I'll try to do is if I make them self-interrogate and just the one phrase, what did you mean by that? Can be really important just to kind of put a timeout and let's regroup. Um, and a lot of times they'll say, "Oh my God, I did not realize that I did X, Y, and Z." And usually it just shuts down right there, and that's great. Usually they self-reflect. The big thing, and I know this is pretty basic, but it's worth reminding. Just be able to redirect them from intention to impact. So, like I had a student one time. They were trying to say people of color, but they used the word colored instead, with all of the historical issues that are wrapped up in that specific term, and uh, they didn't mean to do it, but the harm was done, and so an apology was necessary. And we need to be able to push apologies in the right direction. So again, intention doesn't matter. It's all about the harm that was caused. I apologize to everybody who I harmed in that process. Again, and I can't say this enough, just redirect away from intention. It's all about impact. I always say this is a stupid example, but I loved it. When I was in Mrs. McDaniel's first grade class at Adams School, she didn't care that I didn't intend to step on Becky Blanchard's shoes. I did it. So I had to apologize for the harm I had caused. We intuitively know how to apologize. We just forget how to do it because a lot of times whiteness means never having to say you're sorry. So we're not adept at doing that. So if you can guide it through that, and if you feel like you're making progress, do it. It's incredibly important for people to see their peers atoning for their mistakes, trying to grow as people, doing all of that. I love it. I'm all for that, and that is my default setting. I'm always in that setting. However, and it happens, but it doesn't happen that often. Well, I teach a lot of graduate seminars, so they tend to be a little bit smaller, like maximum like 30, 35 people. When you're doing big lecture halls, it becomes really difficult. So just that's context. If someone is dug in and is just doubling down on racism, if they're doubling down on sexism, if they're doubling down on homophobia or transphobia, or if they're just doubling down on that and refuse to do it, that's the time that we just need to call a timeout. It's totally okay just to say, you know what, we are not doing this right now. Everybody, 10-minute break, leave the room, get some water, come back. And then it's important to check in on folk to see what that impact was, to see how they're experiencing it, how they're flowing through it. So again, that usually doesn't happen that much, but always have in your hip pocket the ability just to call timeout and say, look, we got to stop this. And it's okay also to go up to them and say, like, look, to someone who really doubles down on this stuff, saying stuff like, well, it's just true that Mexican families just don't care about education, and then you've got like Mexican American kids there that are like, what the hell are you talking about? I take a slightly different approach to academic freedom than some of my colleagues do. And what I mean by that is that in the classroom space, academic freedom says that I, as an instructor, have the right to teach, and students have the right to learn. And through my expertise, I'm dictating sort of the flow of that classroom, what will be talked about. But I take a slightly different interpretation. This is not universally accepted, but this is how I interpret it. or let me back up. It's allowed through academic freedom to say that, that which disrupts that's what disrupts this learning environment isn't acceptable. The way that I interpret that, though, is that if students are being targeted by racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, etc., it's very difficult for them to learn. And so from that, I can say, like, look, you may have this racist belief. Your expression of it in this classroom disrupts the flow, and I can't have you continuing to say that. And and they come back, well, I have freedom of speech and freedom of this and freedom of that. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. But ultimately, people forget that academic freedom and freedom of speech are not the same things. They're informed by each other and they're really important. But the point being that ultimately, if you're going to be perpetuating racism in class, you don't have a place in class. And literally, I've never had to go down that road. It's come close, but I've never actually had to go all the way down that road. So I'm just saying that, that's kind of a way around it. But ultimately, when you have classroom agreements and people see each other as people, a lot of times all of this, a lot of it takes care of itself.
All right, so we're coming close to time. So another question is, when land acknowledgements are done, does it recognize that Spain stole the lands from in the West first?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
When land acknowledgements are done, does it recognize that Spain stole the lands in the West first?
No. I mean, it just says that these lands were stolen. I don't think that it really places an onus on, who did it, or, that it's just that these are, wherever it came from, it's ill-gotten gains. If I, if I go and rob a bank and have $100,000 in my pocket and then invest it, it's still ill-gotten gains, whatever it is that I build off of it. Or if my friend robs a bank and then I rob him, it doesn't really matter. It's still an ill-gotten gain. So I don't think that that actual history is as relevant within land acknowledgements, but it's more about the responsibility off of it. So, for example, regardless of who did the land theft initially, the University of Arizona is on stolen native land, period. And so, right now, the way that the conversations go is, well, okay, cool. We have a land acknowledgement, and, we'll increase our native specific scholarships by 10%. And for me, that kind of misses the point, that you're talking $30,000 in a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's not including all of the accumulated wealth through land, buildings, all of that. It shouldn't be a controversial premise that Native students, if you're a part of a recognized tribe, you should go to any accredited university in the United States for free, period. There's just such an imbalance in that theft to the wealth that's been accumulated off of it. It shouldn't even be a controversial premise. And so that's what I'm saying with a land acknowledgement is, that really the onus right now is on these institutions of higher education is what we're talking about, and that's where a lot of the land acknowledgements come from.
Right, so we've got about 7-8 minutes left.
Cool.
So another question is, have you, in higher education, there's a professional expectation for a certain productivity level. Have you found a way to negotiate this expectation without feeling oppressed or that you're stuck in a cycle of capitalism?
Yes, I have. And part of that is a direct result of the faculty who are around me, who support me, my department heads, the senior faculty when I came in, because they told me on day one, because I came in with that exact mentality: publish or perish, publish or perish, publish or perish. And they told me consistently, find your passion. Find a purpose behind this work. What gets you going? What new ground are you going to forge? What are you going to do that no one's done before? You know, the concept of sense of belonging is really important, but in all honesty, within higher education spheres, it's been done to death. And they would tell me that specifically, not to disparage the people who've been doing that work, but to say, don't do what they did just to get another publication. Figure out the new area you want to go in. Create, I hate this book, but I love the title, A Purpose-Driven Life Around Academia. Don't buy that book. That's a bad book. But, well, it's not a bad, well, it is a bad book by a homophobic pastor, but that's a different issue altogether. With that, and I found that passion in two ways. Doing the work in Whiteness, and then also around Tucson Unified's Mexican American Studies program. And when I could see that purpose behind the work, I wasn't doing it just to perpetuate capitalist production. I was doing knowledge production for the sake of the community, with my community always in my heart, with my community always in the back of my brain as I'm trying to go through these different eigenvalues and grounded theory and critical race theory and beta coefficients and all these different things. And having that purpose, it never makes it easy, but it makes it easier. And actually it started to drive me even more because, again, I'm not doing this just to satisfy some quotient. And what ended up happening as a result of that reframing, I ended up being one of the most, actually for the crew that came in with me in the College of Ed, and this is going to sound boastful, so please don't take it as such, the just in terms of scholarly productivity, that I was the most productive in that time frame, not because other people were doing bad work or anything like that, but I had this core of like, oh my God, I'm doing this for these larger purposes, and the productivity followed it. And by just flipping that mental model, find your passion, let the productivity follow, it took care of a lot of that. So I do get, actually, not accused is the wrong word, but some people do say, because I think I've published, well, you don't need to know how many times I've been published, but I've published more than my fair share. And they say, you're just buying into capitalist notions of productivity. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I agree that capitalism pushes us to just produce for the sake of producing, but not all production has to be necessarily rooted in that ideology. And so for me, it was flipping that ideology, and the rest of it took care of itself.
All right, so we're about 2 minutes before time. So you think we have time for another question, or?
Sure, I'll try to be short.
Okay, so how do you communicate the importance of working within the academic scholarship system, or do you?
How do I communicate that? I don't quite understand that. How do I tell students that it's important to produce, or?
That's the question I've got on the Q&A, so.
All right, well, I'll try. I don't personally think that scholarship in and of itself is important, but I think we can make it important. And so I highly encourage students to try to think about their work in multiple phases. You've got to buckle down. You've got to, if you're doing qualitative research, you got to go down. You got to do the line by line coding. It's a grind, but you got to do it. You're doing your quantitative work. You got to make sure that your data are cleaned and that your modeling meets all the specifications. You got like that minute detail that matter to scholars to make an argument. But then beyond that, you have this incredible freedom to put it out there in massive, massive ways. I know that social media I know that social media does still reflect both white supremacist and capitalist tendencies, but it is a more democratized space than we were dealing with, say, in the late 1990s. You can write a research brief. I've seen some amazing work come out of, say, like the UCLA Civil Rights Project, where people take really high level empirical analyses, and step one is write that, step two is write a 5-page brief, and then step three is this is a policy brief. These are bullet points for policymakers, for the general public, et cetera. And you can do that, and you should be doing that, because they always say, well, the numbers speak for themselves. No, numbers are inanimate objects. You've done rigorous scholarly work around it that craft a narrative. Why is this important? And actually, some of that work can help uh, revitalize people, because it reminds, like, when you're in the minutia, you're in the weeds, it's really hard. What's that old cliche? You miss the forest for all the trees. Well, that one pager makes you come back to the forest. It reminds you of your purpose. It reminds you why you're doing what it is that you're doing. And that can be so liberating.
So we're unfortunately at time. There will be a breakout session about white guys on campus following this. The link is on the CLAPS website. Nicole, anything you want to say, or are we good?
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you I appreciate you looking at the Q&A and working through that, and the chat. I'm sorry that I can't keep up with everything. I appreciate you all so much for the engagement.
So,
Okay.
all right, thank you.
All right. So